I want to welcome. Okay, we'll get started now. I want to welcome everyone to this, our fourth session in the Leapfrog Group CAA Compliance Webinar Series. I am Leah Binder. I am the President and CEO of the Leapfrog Group. We were founded by employers, and this is a critical issue for employers. The Consolidated Appropriations Act increases the liability for employers for providing cost-effective, high-quality care in their benefits packages. It also is a true transformation in the transparency of health benefits, and those things are required. The employers are the fiduciaries. They have always been the fiduciaries under ERISA, but the standards for being a fiduciary have been greatly enhanced under this new law. So we want to make sure that employers are aware of it and understand the many ways that it will change the way they do business. Today, we're going to be talking about brokers and consultants. Their contracts will need to change, likely. We'll be talking about techniques for reevaluating your broker consultant contracts and what you should be asking from your benefits professional. We're going to hear from Darren Fogarty, who's Executive Director of the Committee for Fee-Only Benefits Advisors. We're also going to hear from our friends James Gelfand, President of the ERISA Industry, Senior Vice President. James, what is your title?
Just President, Leah.
President, I'm sorry, of the ERISA Industry Committee, and Michael Thompson, President and CEO of the National Alliance of Healthcare Purchaser Coalitions. And you'll also hear my 2 cents as well. We'll all be weighing in a little bit to give you some advice. We also have a toolkit available for free for anyone watching this webinar, as well as the recording of this webinar will be made available on the Leapfrog website. You can put your questions into the chat function. You can start doing that at any time, but we will wait until the presentations have concluded, and we will be opening this up for questions and answers. So to get us started, I'm going to start with Darren Fogarty, and let's just say one thing that I have heard from a number of employers, Darren, which is that their brokers or consultants are saying to them that they don't really need to worry about the CAA, that it's taken care of, or they don't need to worry too much. Is that true?
Yeah, thanks, Leah, and thanks to the whole Leapfrog group for hosting me on this webinar. I'm excited to talk with all of you. Thank all of the attendees for coming. No, I think that couldn't be further from the truth. I mean, I think that the emphasis on transparency is long overdue, and it's actually vital to evaluating the relationship itself. It's so needed and so necessary that I'm not sure how we got all the way here without it being the law of the land explicitly, but here we are. And I think anyone who says that it's not that important, it's really not all that big of a deal, it doesn't change a whole lot, probably doesn't really know what they're talking about. That'd be my opinion. or they have, they have something they don't want to talk about. So that's what I think.
Okay, so what should they be worried about? Tell us.
Well, let me go ahead and start my presentation here for everybody. This is what you should be worried about. We're gonna talk about that today. The Consolidated Appropriations Act, the new requirements that are under this are absolutely historic, like I just said, and like Leah has said, and like she penned in her Forbes article about this at the beginning of this, of all of this stuff starting. And I think it's really such an appropriate time to review the transparency in business and even personal relationships. These CAA rules they're an ounce obligation. But I think that they're a pound opportunity, and I think you'll see what I mean by that by the end of this presentation. So I want to give you a little bit of background on this. Here's the agenda that we're going to be talking about today. We're going to have a little background and needed context, and then we're going to have a refresher on fiduciary duty, what that means, what the CAA changes about those duties, and then we'll talk about next steps for employers and how they should be thinking about their broker and consultant contracts in light of what you deserve in that relationship. So first off, I just want to give some needed background context. You understand where I'm coming at from this. I want to give a couple upfront disclosures. I wouldn't be being transparent myself if I didn't issue these. The first is that I'm not a lawyer. I don't have a JD behind my name. So this is not legal advice. And this is why we have James on the call today, so that he can give us that, rein me back in at times and give us that sorely needed perspective. The second thing is that I work for an employee benefits consulting firm. We have an affinity for transparency, but that's not the official role that I'm speaking at as today. And I just want to be clear about that. So 7 years ago, I started working as a researcher at a DC nonprofit called the Institute for the Fiduciary Standard. And what we do is we analyze and advocate for fiduciary issues and investment advice in the financial services world. So we highlight the importance of the fiduciary standard in financial advice generally. Often an investor who likely has most of their investments in a retirement account gets advice from a financial broker because that advice is nominally free. But the investor is not protected in that relationship because of the conflicts of interest that financial brokers face. And so the Institute believes that these investors would often be better served by working with a financial advisor who adheres to a fiduciary standard of care in that client-advisor relationship. And so I've been focused on analyzing these issues in that parallel world in the securities world. And then 4 years ago, I came over to employee benefits. And I realized that the exact same issues that we're facing in the financial services industry they're a little different in employee benefits because oftentimes it's the plan sponsor interfacing with the broker or the consultant rather than an individual, mother, father, retiree. So it's a little different, but the main issues are really the same. And so I've spent about 4 years researching issues in practicing in fee-based and fee-only employee benefits consulting firms. And so all of these experiences led me to realize that a higher standard of care and of conduct and ethics is needed in the benefits consulting world, which is how I come to you today as the executive director of a committee that seeks to elevate the professional bar and champion transparency and direct fee compensation. So that's where I'm coming at this issue from. And with that as a preamble, let's get into it. So let's talk about the fiduciary obligation that plan sponsors have. So the fiduciary standard is the highest standard of care under the law. It's triggered when one has discretionary control over the assets or the well-being of another. And fiduciary duties roots, they go back almost 4 millennia to the Code of Hammurabi, when sort of the ideas about how one agent should treat another's property were sort of first articulated. It's that ancient. They're vital to a functioning society, otherwise we couldn't have trust in people to manage our affairs. And it promotes and facilitates trust between people in situations of power or knowledge asymmetry. And so what it is in employer health benefits is that because the employee contributes a percentage of the assets to the plan, these assets are commingled with the company's dollars. And so it necessitates and is actually the trigger for the fiduciary liability that plan sponsors have. The Department of Labor enforces this through ERISA, the Employee Retirement Income Security Act of 1974. I'm sure all of you know that. And this is what you must do as a plan sponsor. Let's just run through this real quick. The requirements are to act solely and exclusively in the best interest of plan benefit participants, to pay only reasonable plan expenses. That's a really, really important one that we'll speak a lot about today. To abide closely by plan documents, to carry out one's duties prudently, which I feel like this doesn't get enough attention, but it actually means both with expertise and with a thoroughly documented process. That's a really essential part to this. And one of the things that it doesn't mean, that people get tripped up on, is it doesn't mean that selecting the lowest cost option is necessary. And in fact, I would say that that's sort of that would be a complete misconstrual of one's fiduciary responsibility. It is a very facts and circumstances based standard, which means that it considers finances, but also non-financial things. And so there's no requirement to choose the lowest cost vendor. That's not the case. You want to choose one that's valuable and has reasonable plan expenses, where reasonable sort of has a pretty loose definition, but we kind of know what it means. So how does the CAA modify these existing requirements? Because these, as Leah pointed out at the beginning, these have always been the case. So what's different now? So the CAA's goals were really twofold. The first of it was to inject compensation transparency in a historically opaque space. And the other one was to assist plan sponsors in evaluating and verifying that their plan expenses were in fact reasonable, which, until today hasn't really been the case. It's worth pausing here to consider just how dismal the situation has been for plan sponsors historically. Vendor and broker compensation have been completely unknowable in many cases. It's just not even been, you haven't even been able to know. So how would you be able to determine whether it was reasonable? Value in private healthcare is really difficult to define. It's even difficult to define for the clinicians. So as a plan sponsor, that's obviously quite difficult. And as the Leapfrog group, that's kind of one of the things that they're doing, and they know how difficult it is, but it's still vital. There's massive conflicts of interest everywhere you look in this industry. And nowhere is that clearer than in the 2019 NPR article that sort of kicked off this entire conversation to begin with about just how many ways that brokers and consultants especially were compensated, and employers just had no idea. And so the Consolidated Appropriations Act kind of comes in to this landscape and says things are going to be different from now on. So the law changes the game, and here's what it actually says. So effective as of December 27th of last year, so this has already been in place, the new disclosure requirements apply to persons who provide brokerage or consulting services to ERISA covered health plans. If they expect to receive more than $1,000 in association with your account, either directly or indirectly, and it's in the list of things that they describe is very exhaustive. So this means anything. If they expect to receive that much, they must disclose it to you by law. And so now it's your business to know and to be aware of what you previously did not. You're expected to know these things. And so that does change the sort of the calculation on one's fiduciary responsibility. So here's what you have to do now. And I'm going to walk you through this little flow chart here. The first is that you need to request broker consultant disclosure. They should have already given it to you. You should have already gotten something about it, but if they haven't, you need to ask. If they don't provide it to you within 30 days, then here's what the law says you have to do. You have to notify the Department of Labor, and then you have to terminate your contract within 90 days if they don't give it to you. That's what's that. The power to do that, or the obligation to do that, is pretty vital, because it sort of gives you a sense of how serious the issue is, and it means that you have the right to sort of demand what you have to receive legally, or else. And this is the notice for termination. If they do provide it to you within 30 days, well then that's good. You're going to review the information for reasonable expenses, the reasonableness of those expenses, and the conflicts of interest that your broker consultant has that you may not have known about previously. If you find that those plan expenses are pretty unreasonable, which some people will find that, or that their broker consultant is unduly conflicted, or they got too many contingent relationships going on, then you need to start thinking about issuing an RFP to other brokers or consultants. And you need to provide notice of termination to them and say, this relationship is not working out. It's not helpful. It's not consistent with my fiduciary responsibility to my own plan members. And so here's, we're going in a different direction. If they are reasonable, then, thoroughly document and vet in your process, and say, then this sort of will stand as like if the Department of Labor knocks on your door, you will have everything that you need to respond and say, yep, we did X, Y, and Z. It was all reasonable. Here is the paper trail about what we did. And I think that documentation not only is super important from a liability standpoint, but it's also part and parcel to how a fiduciary is supposed to operate. It's the process that's important, not exactly the end result. And so for plans being renewed or entered into now, and since December 27th of last year, your broker and consultant has to disclose upfront to you. They should disclose it to you in the proposal, in the original proposal. That's something that I've taken note of recently. Here's what they have to disclose to you: the services that they'll provide to your health plan, the compensation that's going to be paid by the health plan for the services it receives, all direct and indirect compensation, we already mentioned this, that they reasonably expect to receive in connection with your account above $1,000, identifying information about the nature and the payer of those services, and any compensation the broker and consultant expects to receive upon the contract termination, and how any prepaid amounts might be refunded back to your health plan. It's worth mentioning that the law does not currently require that they provide actual dollar and cents numbers to you. The Department of Labor has issued clarification on that they can kind of give estimates or percentages or ranges. But I would really, if I were the plan sponsor, I would really ask for it to be given to me in dollars and cents, and try to get that, because it's more meaningful. It allows you to make meaningful comparisons. It is a best practice, and I think it's really important, and it shouldn't be overlooked. So this presentation is going to be in the takeaway toolkit. So I'm not going to read all of these because there's 14 of them. I had to go and pluck them all out, so I know. Here are the sources of compensation that the Consolidated Appropriations Act specifically outlines in the statutory language. And what's striking about the CAA disclosure requirements are how broad and prescriptive they are. It covers virtually everything. And when I think of how little most plan sponsors know about how much their or at least traditionally have known about how much their broker makes on stop loss number 5, for instance, or wellness programs number 7, or their pharmacy services number 6. They're all down there in the bottom left-hand corner. I'm really it's just staggering. It's just staggering how little information has been known. And so even for consultants who have charged a direct fee historically, it may not be exclusive. It probably isn't. And I think it's so timely for us to sort of take a step back and think to ourselves, like, how much are they making? Where is it coming from? And what does that say about whether they're working for my health plan truly or not? That's the sort of the vital question that should sort of percolate to the top. So let's pivot to how this rule is being enforced currently. The Department of Labor issued guidance toward the end of the year, 3 days after it took effect, presumably because they had a lot of questions. And they said that the department will not treat covered service providers, that's the language they use, right? That's the broker or the consultant, as having failed to make required disclosures, as long as they made disclosures in accordance with a good faith, reasonable interpretation of the law. And also, as I wanted to make sure, absolutely sure of this, but it's there. If your broker consultant fails to make the disclosure to you, but made a reasonable, good faith effort to sort of comply with law, even if their disclosure isn't appropriate or isn't right, then ERISA provides conditional relief to you. And so there is this safe harbor here while these rules are sort of taking effect. And and in some ways that's pretty reasonable and consistent with new rulemaking, because it is so new and it takes a lot of adjustment. But it's also important to remember that the safe harbor is not guaranteed to last, and that the CAA, as Leah mentioned at the beginning of this, is still heightened employers' fiduciary liability. And it's heightened it because now you have to know the compensation. It's no longer the case that the courts will just look at what happened if you were to be sued, and they say, oh, well, how could the plan sponsor ever be expected to really know all this information? Because you are expected to know that now. And that's kind of what's changed. So we're moving into the last section of this. And this is the less formal guidance section. And I think sometimes this is where the most value is in some ways. And some people will find a lot of value in understanding exactly what the law requires of them. But in some sense, you could have done that research yourself. But this is sort of the guidance part of it that's less more prescriptive, just general advice based on my understanding of the issues and sort of thinking and talking about it with many people. And I look forward to talking about it with all of you today. What should you demand in your relationship with your broker or your consultant? Expecting is key there. What should you expect? Because I think this is all about expectations. Compensation disclosure is the bar that must be met now, but it really should be understood as the minimum threshold for compliance. And that's what the law requires. It's the bare minimum now. And the CAA presents a unique opportunity, and I really think it should be viewed as an opportunity for plan sponsors to scrutinize broker and consultant business practices for transparency in other ways. It's not just about compensation. You talk about anybody with this for 2 minutes, you'll realize that. And there's a lot of other areas that people should be transparent in their business relationship. And those can't be overlooked either, and they shouldn't be overlooked, because whether or not a broker consultant is suitable for your company is facts and circumstances. It's based on more than just the compensation alone. So doing this not only demonstrates your prudence in your process, which is part of your fiduciary obligation, it also kind of inoculates you against future DOL audits for the reasons we mentioned earlier. That's what's going to be helpful to you in those moments if your company is selected for that. And it's also, just last point, it's consistent with the spirit, not just the letter of the law. That's what this is really all intended to be about. It's really difficult to imagine the Department of Labor issuing a fine or a penalty to somebody that's done their due diligence and gone really above and beyond on this. So I'll leave it there on that. Here's something else that I've been thinking about a lot lately. You can really think of a consultant, a broker. They're functioning on 2 axes that you kind of broad axes that you want to evaluate them on. The first is everybody knows, it's their competency, right? And then it's their transparency too. And so these kind of function on different axes. They're related, but they're distinct kinds of things. So you might imagine, okay, I've been working with a broker. They really know their stuff. They're super competent. They blow me away every time we talk about stuff. They're always, helping me solve my problems and things like that. But it's not a guarantee that they're transparent. So they might be high on on competency, but low in transparency. And then on the other hand, you might have a consultant who's very transparent. They tell you everything that you need to know. They seem very trustworthy. They're very ethical. They're very aligned with your company. But in terms of competency, a little questionable. It's like, are they really able to, to help me in all the ways that I need? And so it's just the truth kind of bubbles to the surface. Transparency by itself is no guarantee that a broker or consultant will be able to help you ensure reasonable fees across the spectrum of your health plan. So you might be able to ensure that their fees are reasonable in some way for them, but that doesn't say anything about the other 14 areas that we looked at. And so what you really want as a consultant, I'm sure you guys can see where this is going, is you want someone who's very competent and ethical. Plan sponsors need someone who is skilled and ethical. And this gold box is really not too much to ask for or to aim at. You want to find somebody that's in there. Reasonable standard. You're not going to find somebody all the way in the tippy top right, probably. It's like very few people like that out there. But somebody who is functioning reasonably high on both of these axes. And I just want to ask you, reflect for a second, who are you currently working with? And do you know who you're currently working with? I think those are two separate questions, but they have slightly different answers. And I think I would want to feel comfortable and confident in who I was working with, and to make sure that brokers and consultants they're absolutely essential to the management of your health plan. They help you make decisions everywhere you look. And you can't afford to be working with somebody who's not transparent and ethical, and competent. As I read this, I want you to notice that none of these questions that I'm about to say, these open-ended questions, can be answered with a simple yes or no. That's intentional. I think these questions are a starting point for evaluating the relationship that you have or are considering having if you're issuing an RFP currently right now. How do you assist me, and this is you as the plan sponsor, right, in meeting my fiduciary obligation to my health plan members to pay only fair and reasonable expenses to you, to our insurance carrier, and to all of our third-party vendors? That would be a question that I want to ask. A consultant who is overjoyed to answer this question, let me count the ways in which I do this for you. That's a great conversation to have. Tells you a lot about the relationship you have right now. Here's a pretty simple question. Are you and your firm financially rewarded or penalized if our company's health plans expenses rise or fall? You might be surprised at the answer that you hear, or if you hear an answer that isn't pretty straightforward. Again, that's information. That's yet more information that helps you understand the type of professional that you're working with. What specific experience do you have in reducing, not managing? That's sort of the language of the status quo industry, to help you manage healthcare costs. So it's like very open-ended, not exactly committing to anything. Oh, we'll help you manage it. No. Reducing, mitigating, lowering healthcare costs while expanding or improving my benefit offerings. I mean, this is what ERISA is all about, right? It's like, are you managing the health plan prudently? Are you managing it to the best of your capability? That's what this looks like. Here, I said the word managing again. So it's impossible to get away from. How do you ensure that you and all of our third-party vendors fully and meaningfully disclose their compensation so that you can fulfill your requirements here that we've talked about today? That's a good question. I'd like to know the answer to that. Here's a really general one that you probably should be asking anyway, separate from these rules. What does transparency look like to you? Say a little bit about that. Put them on the spot and say, what do you, everyone says that they're transparent. Transparency is one of the largest buzzwords that I know of today in healthcare and health insurance. What does it mean to you? Tell me about that. And the last question is, can you give me a past example where you or your firm recognized and mitigated or eliminated, that'd be better, a conflict of interest that you've had? And if they say, oh, we don't have any conflicts of interest. Yeah, if you're a consultant and you have two clients, you have a conflict of interest because you have a client, one client's needs might come at the expense of another. You've only got so many resources at the firm. And so this is very widely recognized in the literature on conflicts of interest that having multiple clients by itself is a conflict of interest. So I would strongly resist the idea that nobody's conflicted, and we're all conflicted in this business. So now I just want to close out and just open this discussion up. Really like to hear from the others on the call today and take questions and talk about it. It's my favorite part of these things. The CAA has cracked wide open this conversation, and we shouldn't let it go to waste. employers, especially self-funded ones, have the responsibility, but more importantly, the opportunity to reevaluate how all their service providers, brokers and consultants, first and foremost, but the others as well, how they're bringing them value and what does it cost you and the plan. This is consistent with the greater healthcare price transparency movement, which I have been such a fan of watching get kicked off in the last 2 or 3 years. Hospital price transparency, insurers being required to disclose the amounts they've actually paid for healthcare prices. That happens in less than 2 weeks. This thing has been going on in the background for quite a long time. The Leapfrog group has obviously been very, very focused on this. And this is just yet another consistency among that. This is what healthcare price transparency means. So we can't let this opportunity go to waste. And we need to have these conversations now, the conversations with our brokers and our consultants, the conversations among people in this industry who have ideas about how to move forward, conversations about, that go far above and beyond the Department of Labor's FAQs and their field assistance bulletins. There are people who've been thinking about these issues for quite some time. And I think that we need to start talking to them. Plan sponsors deserve all the help that they can get in this really muddy industry. And I'm really excited to be able to provide part of that conversation. So with that, I'll go ahead and close. Thank you so much. I'm so excited to talk with all of you today.
Thank you, Darren. That was excellent, and a true call to action. Those are some pretty blunt statements about what I think employers need to be doing to be compliant with this law. I'm going to turn it just briefly before we open to questions to James Gelfand. James, you actually were part of really the leader in many respects of many of the policy initiatives that led to the CAA, as well as the price transparency laws that Darren just mentioned. So what are your reflections? Do you agree with Darren that employers ought to be scrutinizing their consultant relationship this way?
Yeah, absolutely. And Darren, I think you did a great job of explaining what is the new law and what should employers be doing to ensure that you're complying with it. I wanted to step back just a little bit and talk about the why, because that's what I worked on, right? Is why is this done? And I think that for those of you who have been to more than one of these webinars, this is the 4th webinar that Leapfrog has put on different aspects of CAA and different new requirements and new information that's going to be out there. And so you're probably noticing a pattern, right? Which is that Congress, via the Consolidated Appropriations Act, felt that there were a whole bunch of just big, wide holes in the system where employers are supposed to be being good shepherds of the money that's in these plans and that's being spent on employee benefits. But because of all of these holes that were in there, you weren't able to actually effectively do that. And so it's pretty obvious when we're talking about, what are the costs of healthcare that you're actually paying, and those are being hidden from you, or how does your mental health benefit actually work, right? For brokers and consultants, it's a little bit murkier why that matters so much to you. And I think it might help to know that one of the reasons why Congress decided to take action on this particular issue is because as we were working on drafting up the bill that later became the Lower Healthcare Costs Act and then the CAA, Congress was flooded with a number of media articles that were looking at the behaviors that were taking place in the health insurance broker industry. And I had pulled one up. There was my favorite one is one that was in NPR. And they were talking about all of these different fabulous prizes that the insurance companies were paying to the brokers if the broker would convince the plan sponsor to choose that insurance company, right? And one of them, this is a quote from the article. It said, HealthNet of California's pitch is not subtle. A smiling woman in a business suit rides a giant $100 bill like it's a surfboard. Sell more, enroll more, get paid more. In some cases, its ad says a broker can power up the bonus to $150,000 per employer group. This is one of about a dozen examples in that one article. And you'll be reading about things like consultants being paid huge cash payouts, but also like, hey, we're going to be holding a conference in Hawaii for the brokers that did the most sales, and you won't have to pay anything, all expenses paid, and come to Waikiki. All you got to do is convince all those small businesses to choose our insurance and not the other guy. So you know that this is going on, right? That's not a mystery. You also know that the fact that some of these vendors are paying the brokers and are paying the consultants, it does benefit you, right? Because it means in theory that you can pay them less because they have other income streams. So maybe that's good. Here's where it gets complicated. You don't know, at least today, what the broker or consultant is getting in exchange for the money that they're accepting from those vendors. And downstream, you may not know the effects that that is having on your plan and your beneficiaries and the money in that plan. So you might be gaining on the front end by a consultant or broker charging you less, but then on the back end, they have talked you into choosing a carrier or a PBM or some specialty, health vendor like a wellness program or disease management, or some of these very popular new kinds of like maternity health vendors or sleep health vendors that I get emails from 24/7, right? If those folks are paying the consultants, and the consultants that come to you, the plan sponsor, say, trust me, to control your costs, you really want to go with giant PBM number 2, not giant PBM number 1. And then in the long run, you end up paying higher drug costs. Your beneficiaries have higher co-pays and co-insurance. They end up not filling some of their prescriptions. Their health gets worse. You are not being a good fiduciary, right? So you've got risk there. Plus, in the long run, many of my member companies pay 80% of healthcare costs on behalf of our beneficiaries. So you're the one who's really losing more money even than the beneficiaries if you get steered into these bad choices. And so that's what this is really all about, right? We could talk a lot about, well, what do the disclosures look like? And how can you benchmark between one and another? But just keep in mind, that's what this is really about, is that for the last 20, 30 years, maybe longer, there have been relationships that you didn't know about and you didn't understand. And somebody's making money off those relationships, and it ain't the plan sponsor. So now when this all comes to light, you're going to be able to do a better job of managing the funds in the plan and managing the health of the beneficiaries, et cetera. But of course, it's not just for fun, right? You're a fiduciary. You're going to be legally required to utilize the information that you're going to have that you didn't have before. I would say it's pretty expansive, right? So we're talking about not just direct compensation, but indirect compensation. I think the minimum would be a payment of $250 or more. So that is 2 people going to Ruth Chris, right? That is a dinner out somewhere good. And of course, these incentives can get much, much bigger than that. I noticed that one of the things that folks have been talking about is that sometimes these incentives aren't one-time payments, right? Sometimes a broker or consultant can make money per claim, right? Or per beneficiary who chooses to do a certain thing, or per visit of beneficiaries who see a certain kind of doctor or go into a COE or something like that. Now that's going to potentially really, really add up. And you need to know, because if that money is going from the vendor to the broker or consultant every time your beneficiaries do X, Y, or Z, you should be mentally adding that in as a cost of doing business for when that happens. And right now, it's completely opaque. You don't know about it. A couple other things that I wanted to mention. One is that you're supposed to be seeking out this information, right? So if you are hearing like Leah described, if your brokers and consultants say, oh, don't worry about that. It's going to be buried in all the paperwork we send you. Don't bother. You should know that ultimately DOL's authority is over you, right? It's not over vendors, right? It's not over brokers and consultants. So when the law was written with consultations with DOL, their preference was allow us to police the employers since we have authority over them. And in that way, we will indirectly police the brokers and consultants. Now, there are, of course, still consequences for those brokers and consultants who flout the law. but ultimately the buck's going to stop with you. You're the ones who DOL is, comfortable investigating. In fact, for many of my companies, they've already got big open-ended investigations going on, and they'll just add this to the list. Like, let us see your broker compensation, and we'll judge if it's reasonable or not. And I think that Darren made some really incredibly important points about process, right? On day one, there's literally no way for you to necessarily know in a meaningful manner, like, this is a fair fee to charge. This is not a good relationship for this consultant to have with a PBM. And this one seems, standard versus non-standard. That's going to be, you're not going to have that immediately. So you've got to have a process in place, right? So that later when DOL asks you, like, what were you thinking when this big consulting house told you, oh, trust us, go with this PBM instead of that PBM. What were you thinking, right? You need to be able to say, well, we went through it and we evaluated, we asked for that information, we asked around, like, this is our process. Process is your protection, right? And in the same way that going to court process is the punishment, here, process is the protection that you can use to justify that you are being a good fiduciary. We didn't get into the consequences about prohibited transactions and what really happens. I think I would just say on the high level, if it turns out that that you didn't bother checking what the fees were, your broker or consultant didn't bother telling you what they were, in the long run, you could end up being on the hook for all of the ill-gotten gains, essentially, and a penalty on top of that of another like 20%. So this is for real, and there are real consequences here, but we think it's going to be a good thing and a positive step for employers.
Great. Thank you, James. That is good advice. And I like the point about process being important and documenting the process. I would add to that. That at least try your best because and document that you did so. That's pretty much true for 401ks as well. It's being a good steward of resources that you're trying, at least for now. So Mike Thompson, you always have some colorful remarks to add to these things. Tell us what you think.
Yeah, well, this is actually a conversation that shouldn't have taken a law to get us there, right? I mean, this is not, to feel that you should need to be enforced because of compliance to know how people are compensated and whether they have conflicts of interest is absurd. I mean, of course you should know what they're getting paid and you should know how you're paying for it. And James says, well, you may be paying less. There are no free lunches, right? The money that's being paid is being paid by somebody, and it's probably you. And I really appreciate Darren's comment that the fact that you're paying more doesn't make it wrong if you're getting value for paying more. Where I would be very cognizant in thinking this thing through, though, is, I was an advisor for 20 years. And at the end of the day, you want your advisor working for you. There's a concept in real estate called a seller's agent or a buyer's agent. And most brokers in real estate are actually seller's agents. They actually work for the seller. You don't know that because they're showing you the house, but they're working for the seller. They're getting paid by the seller, et cetera. And the same issue comes here when there is compensation that has rewards that may not be in your best interest, right? And it's really difficult, I think, when you're thinking through as a plan sponsor, how do I know that the only consideration is what's in the best interest of the plan, my members, and me as a plan sponsor, and not these other factors? And again, the business models have gotten so blurred over the years. There was a point, I would say, that you could be very confident that the person working for you was working for you, but I don't think it's as clear anymore. And then even the blurring between selling a product, evaluating various products has gotten blurred. I think it's going to be harder to challenge you that you're paying too much, but it's going to be very easy to challenge that you hired somebody who was conflicted, who had a stake in the game, for an outcome. And there's going to be a zillion people shooting at you saying that. And then there's going to be court cases, and they're going to be looking for who else was doing the same thing. And then, there's a court case already down in Florida where somebody's being pointed at, and you'd say, well, if one plan sponsor is looking at a situation, what if I'm also a plan sponsor doing the same thing? Why do I think I won't be similarly vulnerable for not taking the same action that other plan sponsor did? So I think you've just got to be doing your job. And I'm I've got grandkids now, and one of our favorite movies is El Canto, and of course the song. We don't talk about Bruno, right? Well, nobody wants to talk about that. I mean, your broker, your consultant, if they're worth their weight in gold, is one of your friends. They're one of the peoples you truly trust and like to be around. But unfortunately, the job comes first too, right? And you've got to do your diligence and do your job. And it doesn't mean you can't use them, but I think you got to be very serious about what do you use them for. Because if they have skin in the game to do one thing versus another. And I'll tell you, when I was a consultant, I've had clients come to me and said, I went to such and such conference of my consulting firm, and it wasn't even a broker in that instance. And I heard from leadership, we're going to push this. And she says, that's not what I'm expecting from my consultant. And that's one of the reasons she moved to a different consultant. For that, she's looking for somebody who's going to think about her needs and move in that direction. I've also heard stories from consultants and maybe less so from brokers, but certainly from consultants who have said, I don't like how I'm being constrained and how I advise my clients. I'm being told to push this or that because that's what contributes to the bottom line. And they themselves feel conflicted in that way, and it's not the way they want to do business. And I think it's incumbent on all of us to have these hard conversations. We don't talk about Bruno, but I don't think you got a choice anymore. And then let's figure out how to get it right going forward. And again, it may be just like a judge has to recuse themselves from some of the work, they may have to recuse themselves from some of the work too. If they have my favorite one is, everybody's got the best PBM deal. I don't understand it. Everybody's got the best PBM deal. And sure enough, when they evaluate, they win almost every time. How could everybody have the best PBM deal, right? If you have a stake in one deal, maybe you're not the independent source to do the evaluation, right? I think you've got to be thinking that through. And so this is a brand new world, but it's not a brand new world. I mean, this has always been there, but I think they're shining a light on it. And I think the lawyers are going to suit up. And I think in this area, the facts and circumstances are going to be obvious. I always have guided myself over time in saying, my 60 minutes moment, when they shine the light on what's going on, can I stand in front of that camera and answer the questions with my head up? And I think all of us have to be aware of those 60-minute moments going forward.
Yes, so 60 minutes and grandchildren. Yes, I knew that you would have a pointed response, Mike. And I think you're right, though. I think that we have to, it's better, it hurts sometimes. And these are sometimes uncomfortable conversations, but at the very end of that conversation is a catharsis for not, and I hadn't thought of it before until you said this, but for the consultant as well. If there are issues with it, it allows everybody to practice to the height of their abilities and to the best benefit of the employee, which is kind of what we all want out of our legacy in life. So, so a good thought for us to, as we look at this.
Can I respond to the personal aspect of the distinguishing the firm between the firm and the representative, the broker, the consultant? I think this is a vital point, and it's one that doesn't really get enough talking about, which is that these issues of these conflicts of interest are rarely individual people's problems. They're usually firm level policy problems. Some research that we did a couple of years ago at the Institute found that on a 64-page disclosure of Ameriprise, which is a bank, a big financial institution, right? It has a lot of brokers. And this is in the financial services world, right? On page, I think it was 22 of that long document in fine print, it said that Ameriprise actually shields their own representatives from understanding how the firm is compensated. fully, because they believe that that is a way of mitigating the conflict of interest.
Wow.
And that was just so shocking when I read that, because I'm just sitting there thinking to myself, I mean, I guess you could probably, do a cartwheel and flip backwards to get to that conclusion, but that's just so wrongheaded. And it really just demonstrates how big of a problem we've got here, because the actual representatives don't even know how the firm is being compensated. And when I ran that idea by a few consultants in this industry who have sort of made the exodus from the more traditional consulting firms to more fee-based, very strongly fee-based, they say, oh my gosh, Darren, it's the exact same thing in this industry. I mean, I had no idea how my firm was being paid. When I learned, I was just like sickened. And I think that is helpful to understand, because it frees you from feeling overly adversarial to somebody you may have been working with for 15 years, because it's not like it could very well be the case they don't even understand the issue really much more than you do. And I also think that the reason why this transparency, this Consolidated Appropriations Act, this disclosure requirement is so helpful is because it allows you to broach that conversation in a way that is not adversarial. You can come to your consultant and you can say, hey, I got this new requirement that I really think it's serious. I want to take a look at this with you. Let's figure this out together. I need to know how much you're being paid. And you can sort of couch this in the language of being on the same side of the table with them, even if you might suspect that they might be, might have been pulling the wool over your eyes. You can still use this as a tool to say, I have to ask you this question. We have to talk about it. Otherwise, I'm not doing my job. And so this isn't personal. This is something that I need to understand. And I think that's incredibly, so there's a few different points there. It's not exactly like the professional is unethical necessarily. They could be working within an unethical system. That's point number one. And the second point is that it doesn't need to be, I don't want to diminish the fact that some of these broker consultant relationships are very, very personal and are very important. And that's difficult. It's extremely difficult. In the same way as Mike pointed out that I really like my realtor. When I just bought a home, I just moved in less than a month ago. I really liked our realtor, but I also always kept in mind that she wasn't being paid by me. And even though she's purporting to represent my interests, there is this sort of slight difference there that I need to keep in mind and be aware of. So anyway, I just wanted to mention that.
Thank you. Okay, we have some questions, so I'm going to try to put them out there for now. We have a couple of questions about whether we offer standard or are there any standard or template formats available for these disclosures for employers to use to get these disclosures from brokers. Do you know about that, Darren? Do you know if there's?
Yeah, I'm aware that there are a lot of firms that have offered that type of thing. I think. So first of all, I think if you talk to somebody who's pretty experienced in writing these types of things, it's probably just a page or two. It's not some lengthy, huge thing, and it needs to have the questions for those six points that I made in my presentation. It'll be available to afterward. I could pull them back up now, but it would take a couple seconds, so we'll do it now. But it has a certain amount of fields there that describes the nature and the pair of the services, fees upon the termination of the contract. So when we did ours, I helped write ours at the firm I worked for previously, and it was pretty quick to do, but it's very inclusive. It had everything that it needed to have. I'm hesitant to give templates because I do think that the plan sponsor should be thinking about this stuff and should sort of come like, here's my questionnaire, here are the things that I need to know. And it should be a process that's led by them, specific to the nature of their relationship with their consultant. So I want to be sensitive to that. And at the same time, if it would be really helpful, and I did see a couple questions in the chat fairly early on, I could, talk with my committee members and we could probably come up with a pretty standard example of a disclosure form to be filled out that included everything, and maybe left some room for some customization. So yeah, I think you could look around and find one that would reasonably serve your interests as a template and sort of tweak it to make it good for you. I'm also open to sort of retroactively making that part of the toolkit. That would be something I would enjoy working on. So
All right, well, we'll follow up on that then with the participants later on. But in the meantime, what you've given us to start with is a good kind of structure that you can begin with to develop that set of questions for your own use. We have a question about, can one of the panelists comment on what has or has not been delayed relative to the pharmacy benefit disclosures, including machine readable files that were originally due in December 2021. Does anyone know about that?
I can give a little, I mean, so folks are aware that after a 6-month delay, starting in July, employers have to post their machine readable files online that has to include their in and out of network costs. Now, there was supposed to be another file that would be posted that would include all of the pharmacy costs too, but that is currently in limbo, right? It's indefinitely delayed. We're waiting for DOL to say something about it. You know, there are rumors that the way that the Department of Labor got the Chamber of Commerce and the PBM industry associations to drop their lawsuits was to agree to indefinitely suspend that requirement. Don't know if that's true. That's just something that's been said. But of course, those lawsuits were dropped, right? They were not seen through to their conclusion. And as a result, DOL pulled back the pharmacy disclosure and has not specified when it will, be finalized or if it will ever be finalized. That being said, there is, of course, an additional pharmacy disclosure piece, not from the transparency and coverage rule, but from the Consolidated Appropriations Act. That one was more information about aggregate pharmacy costs and what were the top 10 most expensive drugs that you paid for and that kind of stuff. That's still following the timeline originally proposed. But in terms of the transparency rule that kicks in 10 days, you're good. You don't have to do pharmacy for now.
Okay, we have a couple of questions about who this law applies to. There's one, we're a municipality and are exempt from ERISA. However, we do have a broker. Does this apply to us? There's also a question about whether it applies to other than self-insured employers.
Well, I think that James answered the one about self-insured employers. I do agree with him that it does apply to fully insured plans as well. And in fact, that you might be really surprised to know how they make their money. And so, like, I sort of think almost sometimes the problem could be is almost kind of worse in the fully insured market. I know that there's some good research for benchmarking purposes on fully insured plans. Some Johns Hopkins researchers did some research at the end of 2020 that found the median fully insured commission rates. So they have range and they have a median, and they sort of looked at the small to the large market, and that might be helpful in helping you benchmark your cost to determine whether or not the commission is reasonable or not. Generally, the commission goes down as a percentage the larger you are, and so you can kind of use that as a rough estimate. And you mentioned the use of the municipality question. You mentioned that already. That one I would want James to weigh in on. I'm always a little fuzzy on the distinctions between how these union and municipality health plans run as opposed to the employer market, because there's a lot of similarities, but there are also fine points of difference. Do you know for sure, James, one way or the other?
No, I'd have to go back and check. Sometimes the rules would be a little bit different for a government plan, a church plan, and perhaps a Taft-Hartley plan. But here's the thing. That whatever brokers or consultants that you're using are servicing plans to which the rules do apply, which means that they're disclosing this information to everybody else. So in the very least, you should still get it and you should still use it, right? And if you find out that you're being ripped off, you should still fire your consultant or broker. The only thing that we actually need to go and check is, how bad could you potentially be penalized for not doing that? But that information is now going to be available. So, you have just as much a right as any other customer to demand it.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting that.
Let me ask one, just follow up on one question. What I might think of as an elephant in the living room while we have like 5 more minutes here, but if the Department of Labor does not address the compliance issue with you as an employer, what are the legal ramifications in terms of your risk of exposure to courts?
Well, James should definitely answer that one for sure. But I will say that it's not only the Department of Labor that could sue you. I mean, your own employees could say, how much am I paying for healthcare? Like, this is just crazy. It's been like going up. It's gone up like 50% in the last 10 years. And I suspect deeply that my employer is really not doing their due diligence on this because something's not adding up. And if they can start talking to each other, and you might have a class action lawsuit on your hands. So I'll pause there and let James take over. But that's
That happened, James?
Yeah, I mean, Darren, you nailed it. I mean, when transparency came in for 401ks, it wasn't primarily the DOL going in and looking at everybody's fees. It was our good friends, the trial lawyers, who were suing. Really, they were suing a whole lot of colleges and universities. Those were the juiciest targets they started with. In this case, there's no reason it should be any different, right? If it turns out that one of the big brokerage houses or one of the big consulting houses is a ripoff, and that becomes well known, and you're still using them, and then you are potentially liable to these plaintiffs bar going to your employees and finding a couple of them and saying, let's sue your employer. They're wasting your money on benefits, and we can get a nice penalty. It'll be potentially worth the entire cost of their contract with their consultant plus 20%. And we lawyers will take 75% of it, and each of you will get a couple $100. What do you say? That I wouldn't be surprised at all if that was something that is likely to happen.
And I've spoken to a couple of attorneys who think that the likelihood of that increasing in the next few years is very much a possibility. So for what it's worth.
Okay, there's a couple of questions. Thank you. There's a couple of questions. I don't even understand this question, but maybe James, especially you probably do. Does 5500 Schedule A information report the compensation, or are you talking about additional compensation not reported on Schedule A? And I think,
So
do you think the broker will actually report contingent commissions?
I was just going to say that the Form 5500 information is like a partial disclosure for this, right? So if your broker was to say, oh, well, you have this information, it's on your 5500, you're being gaslit, and you're not getting all of the information. Particularly, you're not getting any information about indirect compensation. So that's you got to keep in mind, this isn't really about what you're paying them. It's about what they're being paid by others to get you to make decisions in your plan. And that's just a different animal. It's never been legislated before. Okay,
and do you feel that brokers will report contingent commissions received from health plans?
I mean, they have to. It's not optional, and it's not ambiguous in the law, right? It's clear that they need to report to you, if I meet these certain metrics, I'll get this certain, money. And, Darren alluded to this, but they may not be able to give you a dollar amount today, but they can give you a formula, or they can give you the design of this compensation aspect that they have. So they need to provide you with something, right? What they can't say to you is, yeah, of course I'm going to get paid, but nobody knows what that money is going to be until later. So I just not going to tell you anything.
Yeah, that will be the posture that you will get is, well, we can't really know. How are we ever supposed to calculate that type of thing? It's like, I mean, if I put my informal guidance hat on, it's just bullshit. I mean, it's just crazy. The disclosures that we were writing were, even when we couldn't possibly know, we would give a percentage amount. We would say, here's the formula, and then here are a range of, like, if you were to experience 20% growth in your employee population over the next year, because that was a possibility for a particular client, here's how it would change. I mean, there's so many different ways that you can ask for further clarity on these types of things. And the idea that they would respond and just say, and give you some basically they wouldn't pin themselves down on this. It's just absurd, and you shouldn't stand for it, because you deserve more than that as the consumer.
Mike, you have like 2 minutes left.
Yeah, I think it's important to recognize that the business models of intermediaries have changed dramatically in the last 20, 30 years, dramatically. And there's so many side deals underway now that unwinding those would not only be difficult, but very, very costly. I mean, people have a strong vested interest in those things not going away. And so it's going to be very difficult to navigate this. Under those circumstances, people are having to write disclosures. Well, you can bet they've got a slew of people figuring out, how do we word it? Where do we put it? How do we do this? How do we do that? And at the end of the day, you're going to get a document that may in fact comply with a disclosure. That doesn't change the fact that you should ask good questions. And I think part of what Darren is trying to say is play your job, do your job, just ask good questions. And if they're waffling, keep asking questions, right? Because the fact that they've got some weasel words in there, you know, we've seen it in parts of the industry where weasel words cost you zillions of dollars. You've got to know, you've got to ask the right questions. And again, don't be afraid. And the more transparent they are, the more they give you definitive answers, probably the less you've got to worry about. But honestly, what you know and how they're making money are two different things. It's a big difference. And you've got to start with that presumption until they tell you otherwise. Because, anyway, so I'll stop there.
Okay, well, thank you, Mike. I think asking the right questions is the key point here. And that will protect you, that at least you're asking the questions. That will help you in being compliant with this very significant new law, that you are making an effort, that you're putting forward the process necessary to protect yourself and your employees and be transparent, and insist that your vendors are transparent as well. So I want to thank my guest, Darren Fogarty. Thank you so much for that great overview of this incredibly significant issue of how consultants and brokers play into the CAA. And of course, thanks to James Gelfand and Mike Thompson as well, as usual, for being part of this. And thank you all for joining us, and take a look at that toolkit. And there will be next a session of this. The 5th one will be coming up. Stay tuned. We'll let you know when it's scheduled. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much.
Thanks.